Hey there, Jonas Pilz here, Master Trainer at Maxon, and today I want to show you how to use MoGraph and a few other generators to create rigs for your visualization projects. As some of you might already know, I have a background in industrial visualization and I work for big companies in the manufacturing, automotive and mobility industries, and therefore I had to create many rigs for streets, guardrails, power lines, train tracks, and such things. And I created them just to stay flexible until the end, because usually the client comes in the very end and asks for changes. You know that. So what all of these things that I just mentioned have in common is that they are long, which means that they can be perfectly based entirely on a single spline. And that's what I want to show you today. So here are a few examples. What we see here is a real production street rig that I made for a futuristic city scenario. And if we select the Xpresso tag, this is where I have all of the controls. You can see that we can adjust the main spline, the rail spline. And if I select the main spline here, we can simply move around some of the points here and everything will adjust. So let's have another look at the controls. We can adjust the width of the street and also the distance of these guardrail stands here. If we just move the slider here a bit, we can adjust the count of lines here. So we can create 5 lines instead of just 3, and also adjust the distance of these stripes here. We can adjust the bridge height, the width or distance, and all those things. And the cool thing is, because this is based on a spline, we can even make the car visible. And here you can see that we have an align to spline expression on it. So we can use the very same spline to make that car follow the street, and then simply use the position slider here in order to make it drive along the street. If you have another null in here, you can even move it to another line. And if we now adjust the position slider, this car will always drive on that line. So that's a pretty cool setup and very flexible. Also, if we, for example, now adjust the shape of the street again and move it to this place, you can see that the car always is in that line. It will always stay in that line. All right. Let's go to the next example, and I want to show you this power line rig. It's a lot more basic, but what we have here is a power line setup following a spline, and you can see that the whole thing is adjusting. And if we have a look at the Xpresso tag and the controls that I added here, we can again adjust the spline. We can set the mass distribution from step to spline vertex. So now it's here on these spline vertices. If we go back to step, we can adjust the mass distance. We can also adjust the alignment, so we can make it so that it aligns to the surface or that it's straight up. And we can also adjust the wire hanging. That's also pretty cool. And now let's go to the next setup here, my rails finished setup. And this is also the one we're going to use for today's session. So if I go to the Redshift menu and enable the Redshift render view, you can see that this is our setup here. So all of these matrices that you see here are going to be replaced by stones, and we can move around. It's really fast. We can also adjust things, but maybe let me disable the render view here so we have a little bit more space. So let's have a look at this. So this is what we are going to create. And here you can also see that in this case, I just have one object here. The other objects are hidden. And we have this user data tag here instead of the Xpresso tag. And we have a main spline, a rail spline, and we can also adjust the fastening type. So you can see it here that the fastening is changing. We can enable or disable the stones. We can adjust their seat, and we can also adjust the ground level of these stones. But now let me also have a look at the spline here, and let's move some points. You can see that everything is adjusting as expected. We can also rotate the whole spline, and this way you will see that the rail spline is perfectly working. Let's undo this for now. And instead, let's go to the user data tag here, and let's throw in the circle spline here instead of the main spline. And let's also replace it here in the rail spline, which is just an instance of the main spline. So here we are going to input the circle, and now everything is based on that circle. So it's a very flexible setup, and now let me show you how we can create this. In order to do so, I'm going to go to my Rails start scene. And here we go. Let me open up Redshift, and in this case, I'm going to use the viewport IPR because I already created all of these materials. Here you cannot see them because under options, I disabled materials for now. But what you can see here is that we've got two fastenings here, which are based on concrete, or which are made of concrete, and one is made of wood. And we can also see that our Redshift materials are already set up here. So here we've got a lot of rust, but based on the curvature, we also see shiny edges here, and also here the nuts and stuff like that. You can also see the stones, and actually these things here are stuff that I downloaded from TurboSquid. And let me go to the site here. So the stones are the Dark Stones pack by Frank Canistra, and the rail fastenings here are the ones by Black Everyday. And I had to adjust them a little bit because what you can see here already is that the rails are not in line. So I remodeled those concrete fastenings here, or the ground plates for them, so to speak, so that the rails are matching. Okay, cool. Let me go back to Cinema 4D, and now let's start to create this. But first, let me get rid of the Redshift viewport IPR, and I also want to fold the stones and just make them invisible. So now we just have this spline here for one rail and the rail fastenings. What I want to do first is I want to create a symmetry setup for this here. So what I'm going to do is I select the rail, and then I go to this menu here and hold down Alt to make the symmetry object apparent of the one rail spline that we have here. And now I select the one rail spline and move it to the side until it's here in the fastening. And let me go to the front view here, and I just want to eyeball it. That's good. All right, the next step is to, well, extrude it along a spline, and therefore we need a sweep. But in order to create a sweep, we need the profile spline. We already have that. And we need a spline that is like defining the shape of the sweep. So let me go to top view. And what I want to do now is I want to use the spline tool here and set its type to B-spline. And then I'm going to activate snapping. I'm going to enable it. And let's make sure that it's set to grid snap, because this way I can snap the points of the B-spline here to the grid. And this is what I want, because this way I can make sure that we're having a straight line. Okay, press escape to escape from the interactive mode and disable snapping. And here we have our spline. So now let's create a sweep. All right, we're going to get that sweep from this menu here. That's the spline generator menu. And we want to create this one. And I want to throw in the symmetry already, because this is going to be our profile. But I don't want to use our main spline here directly. I want to create an instance of it. That's for flexibility reasons for later. So let's create that instance and let's use it here. Okay, now we see two things. First of all, it's not centered. So how can we make it centered? Basically, Cinema 4D doesn't see the symmetry object or the symmetry spline here as one spline. And what we can do in order to make Cinema 4D see it as one spline is we can create a connect object. So with the symmetry object selected, I hold down Alt and create a connect object. This way the connect will automatically be created as a parent, and here we go. Now it is centered, but you can see that it's the wrong way around. So let me select the spline here and let me go to the move tool and let's move the last point here of the spline. And if we do so, you can see that depending on the direction of the bending here, the spline is flipping. So what we need is a rail spline. So let's create a rail spline. And I also want to create an instance of the main spline to create the rail spline. So let's go to this menu here and let's create another instance. This is going to be our rail spline, and we're going to place it here in the Objects Manager, and in the Coordinates tab of it, we're going to move it up by 50 centimeters. It's a good idea to use a number here that you can remember easily, because we have to make sure that all of the rail splines and all of its instances are placed in the very same position. So now I'm going to create another instance of that rail spline. I know it's getting confusing right now, but it will make sense in the end, I promise you. So here we've got our rail spline instance, and I'm going to place that down here. So let's make sure that position Y is 50. That's correct. Okay, and now you see that this is happening. That's also not correct, because what now happens is that the sweep is using the rail spline not only to align it, but also to define the size or the width of that profile. So what we can do is we can uncheck use rail scale. This way it will be the correct size. And the second thing we have to do is, because it is rotated by 90 degrees, we can go to the Details tab and scroll down. And here there is the rotation section, including the rotation spline. But you can see that the rotation is set from minus 180 degrees to plus 180 degrees. And I just want to set this number here to 0, and this will align everything perfectly. So now, if we select the spline and move the last point to the right and to the left, you can see that the spline is not flipping anymore. We can see that there are some problems here in this bendy area, and this is because we set the intermediate points to adaptive. If we set them to uniform and maybe the number to, let's say, 32, this is all smooth. So pretty cool. All right, now let's rename this sweep here. This is going to be our rail. And let's create the next thing. The next thing I want to create is the setup for the fastenings here. And what I want to do there is, first of all, I'm going to hide the whole group, and then I'm going to select the first one, concrete 1, and create an instance of it. So the reason why I made the group here invisible instead of the separate ones is that if I make the separate fastenings here invisible, you can see that they also disappear in the instance. But what you can do is you can instance these objects here and make the parent invisible, and this way the instance will show up. All right, cool. So this is our fastening, and we're going to place it here. Now we need to clone it, also along this spline. So let's do this with the fastening selected. I just alt-click the cloner and we cloned it. Good. Now let's set the mode to object, and we want to clone this one along the spline. So let's bring in the main spline here, and let's also bring in our rail spline here into the rail link field. And then I'm going to set the distribution from count to step, and I'm going to set the step to 80 centimeters. So this is looking quite cool. And now let's also have a look at the instance object here. The cool thing now is that we can swap the fastening type simply by dragging and dropping in another fastening type. So that's something we're going to automate later, but for now this is already working. The other thing that is working is that if we, for example, now make the rail spline editable, and let's say we move this point here, you can see that we can already rotate the whole setup. So that's cool. Let's undo this until we have our instance object back. Here we go. And I'm also going to select the last point here again and just set it to 0 in its X position so that it's straight again. Okay, that's cool. Let me also create a null and place it here. We are going to call it fastening, like so. And we're going to place this one here. And we also want to make sure that our fastening types are in there, just to keep stuff clean. Good. Let's fold this away. And the next thing I want to create is the rock bed, or the bed of stones here. And we're going to use a similar setup to the rails here. So let's go to the front view, and I want to use or create a spline which is defining the profile here. So let me use the spline tool again, and I'm gonna set it to Bezier. And I'm also going to create or to enable snapping again, and yeah, grid and work plane snap is okay. So let's start here and let's create our first point. And then I'm going to go to something like this and yeah, just create a spline like that. And then I'm going to this line and create another point. Then I'm going to go to this line. And the reason I turned on snapping is simply because I want this to be almost symmetrical. Well, I could make it perfectly symmetrical, but I don't want that. And I'm going to set the last point here. Okay, that's my profile spline for the rail bed, or for the rock bed spline. Okay, now let's create a copy of that rail setup, and we're going to call this, let's delete this one and instead use this one here. We are going to call this rail bed, and in here I want to replace the connect with the rock bed spline. And if we go to the perspective view, we can now see that it's all looking pretty good. And also, if I now make this spline here editable, our rail spline, we can move one point here and everything will move around and rotate. That's perfect. Okay, one thing that isn't perfect, but you cannot see it yet because we don't have a texture on here, is that our texture mapping is pretty distorted. So let me create a new material, and I'm going to add a checkerboard texture and make it 20 by 20. And I'm going to assign it here to the rail bed. And of course, because I disabled materials, I now have to enable them. And here you can see the problem. So what I want is equidistant distribution along our profile spline. But you can see that this is not equidistant at all. And even if we adjust our rock bed spline here, let's say the intermediate points to uniform, you can see that some stuff is changing, but you won't find a type that gives you the perfect or the correct result. So what we need to do is we need to resample that spline, and we can do that by using a MoSpline object. So let me create a MoSpline from the MoGraph menu here, And we are going to set its mode to Spline. And then in the Spline tab, we are going to use our rock bed spline as the source spline. And now we're going to move this out of this rail bed sweep object, and we're going to use the Mo spline instead. As you can see, well, it's actually looking pretty good. We can also set this to even. That would be the very same, and I will leave it at even. So now we can see that the checkerboard here has equidistant distribution in both directions. It is stretched. We will take care of that later, but it is equidistant. So by using the Mo spline, we are able to resample a spline so that our textures in the end won't be distorted. Good, now let's tidy things up. And in order to do so, I'm going to create another null, and I'm going to place it here. I'm going to double click the railbed object here and just copy its name and use the up key 2 times and just paste it up here. And now I'm going to make all of these objects here children of that group. Okay, so that's looking good as well. And now I want to take care of the stones. So what we could do is we could clone the stones directly, but this is something that can be really slow, especially if we have lots of stones in the end. And we will end up having like 500,000 of these stones here. So instead of just cloning them, we are going to use a matrix object. And because we want to render the whole thing in Redshift, there is an object that is called matrix scatter. And this is basically a Cinema 4D matrix object with a Redshift tag on it. So I'm going to use that here, or I'm going to move it to this place. And I'm also going to set its mode to object. And in this case, I want to use our railbed as an object. And here you can already see that the stones or the matrices are appearing, but we need a few more of them. Let's bring it up to 20,000. And here we go. That's something we can use. Now, the cool thing already is that we can go to the transform tab, and by using its PZ value, we can adjust the level, the ground level of these stones. So this is pretty cool. We have to remember that later because we can use that in our Xpresso. Okay, the next thing I want to do is I want to randomize this whole thing. So first of all, maybe let me create another null, move it to this place. Again, to tidy things up, I'm going to call this one stones. And I'm going to drag and drop these objects here into that new group null. Okay, the next thing I want to do is randomize these stones in position and rotation. So let me go to the MoGraph menu and create a random effector, and I'm going to hold down Command or Control on the PC. And this way, the random effector will be created on the same hierarchical level as everything else. And this is cool because we already have that group. Okay, now let's go to the parameters tab, and we're going to bring down all of the positions to 5. So that's already better. Then we're going to check scale and uniform scale. Let's set it to 0.2. And now the most important one, rotation. Let's set this to 180 by 180 by 180. And now this is looking really cool. If we go back to the matrix object, we can still go to the transform tab and move these clones up and down. So that's pretty cool. All right, now let's say, well, let's move them up a little bit more. Let's move them up by 4 centimeters. That's pretty cool, because what we can see now is that some of these are intersecting here, of course, because we just created those clones on the whole rock bed here, on the whole rail bed. So let's have a look from the top, and we can see, of course, they are intersecting with the fastenings. What if we don't want that? All right, and we also don't want this to be a dynamic or simulation setup. We just want them to be like cut out. One way how to do this is by using a plane effector. So let's create a plane effector, and I'm gonna hold down Command again to create it on the same hierarchical level. That's plane visibility. And in the parameter tab, I'm going to uncheck position and I'm going to check visibility. As you can see, nothing is happening. Now, in the fall off tab, we can use these fastenings as a mask for the stones. But because the geometry here is, well, not super light, we can make this more efficient. So what I will do is I'm going to create a new mask or geometry to mask these stones out. And this is going to be very simple geometry. So let me go to the fastenings, and I'm going to create a copy of that cloner here, like so. We don't need this one, it was still selected. And I'm gonna call this stones mask. And instead of using the fastening instance here, I'm going to create a cube, and I'm gonna make it the dimensions of these fastenings here, which is around 250 by 50 by 20, something like that. And I'm just gonna throw that cube into the cloner here. And now if we go to perspective view, you can see that this is our setup. Well, of course, that's not very beautiful, but we just want to use these cloned cubes as the mask for these stones here. So let's go to the plane visibility effector, and I'm just going to try dragging and dropping our stones mask into the field list. And well, I'm going to use a point object to do so, and you can see everything is disappearing. And if I bring up the radius here, nothing is happening. And that's a problem. So it doesn't work by default. I just saw that I've got a typo in here. So that's the stones mask, not the stoner's mask. And instead, as we did before with the spline, when we created the symmetry, we have to create a connect object. And now it sees the whole setup here, the whole cloner setup, as one piece of geometry. And let me again double click this, copy, go one up, paste, and now select the plane effector and just drag and drop this in here. You can see it's the very same effect for now, but if I now select the stones mask here in the field list, I can bring up the radius and you can see that clones are appearing. So here we go. That's a pretty cool thing. So we can already make this connect object invisible. Right, now that's what we have. Okay, not perfect. Let me go to the top view because here we can see everything a little bit better. Instead, we could use surface mode, but that's also not perfect. Let's go to volume. We're going to use volume mode here. And by default, you can see that we now only have those stones inside of the fastening mask. So we need to invert it. Of course, we can do that. We simply select the stones mask here, go to its remapping tab and check invert. And now you can see that we don't have stones in here anymore. You can see that they are still a little bit intersecting, but now we can simply go to the cube object and just bring up the Z size. And here you go. You can now see that we are subtracting stones here. And I think that's okay. So now we have a setup that is very flexible, that doesn't involve dynamic simulation, and therefore it is really fast. So let's double check this. Let me now, for example, move some of the spline points here. Let's move this one. You can see that it's reacting immediately. There is no delay and such things. Okay, let me also make the rail spline editable for now. And let's move one of the points here. That's also working. Okay, so actually what we just did is we finished the setup, and now we can make the setup easier in order to be used by someone else, because right now it's a pretty complicated thing. If we now create a setup for that, like user data and stuff like that, then this would be much easier to use. Okay, let's do this. First of all, I'm going to create a null and I'm going to rename it. This is going to be called train track generator. Let's double check. Yeah, no typo in there. And I'm going to place it here. And I'm going to make all of these objects here a child of the train track generator null. Okay, the next thing I want to do is I want to create my interface, and I'm going to use a user data tag for that. It's under programming tags, and actually this tag's only purpose is to hold user data. And we created a separate tag for that, so that you know that this tag is holding all of the user data and not the Xpresso tag or not the null, for example, because this is also possible. We're going to use the user data tag to keep things tidy and clean. Okay, let's rename this to train track controls. And now we can add user data. All right. In order to do so, we have to go to user data, manage user data, and then our user data manager is coming up. And we want to create the interface we saw before, and we're going to add some data here. So first of all, I want to add a link field for the main spline, and the type, the data type, is going to be a link. All right. The next one, and I can just create a copy of this one, is going to be the rail spline. So here we go, rail spline. Next, I want to control the fastening. And so what I want to do is I add some data, and I'm going to set the data type to separator because I want a separation here. I'm going to call this fastening. And next, I'm going to create the interface for the fastening type. So let's add some data. And what we need here actually is something to swap the reference object inside of the instance object we have here in the fastening section. So I'm going to set its name to type, and now we need the right data type. So float is not correct. We can do a lot of things using integers, because integers are the data type which allows you to create radio buttons and stuff like that. And this is exactly what we need. So let's set this to integer, and we're gonna use another interface. We're gonna use QuickTap radio buttons. And now this whole thing appears, and we have a little bit of an instruction here. So what we need is a value, semicolon, a string. So I'm going to type this here, and after that I'm going to explain what it means. I'm going to type in 1, semicolon, concrete 1. So this is going to be my first menu entry, and it's going to use the number 1 to reference it, and this is the string. So by using 1 later, we want to reference concrete 1, the fastening type concrete 1. Now let's create the next line. 2, semicolon, concrete 2, because we have 2 types of concrete fastening. And then the last one, 3, is going to be wood. And now if I just click somewhere else, you can see that this is our interface. So we can choose between concrete 1, concrete 2, and wood. And based on what we choose, this will output 1, 2, or 3. This is what these numbers here are doing. Okay, now the next thing I want to do is I want to copy the separator line here and rename this stones. And now we're going to set up all of the stone settings. First of all, we want a checkbox to enable and disable the stones. And therefore, I'm going to add some user data, call it enable, and I'm going to set the data type to Boolean, because Booleans are the data type that allow you to create checkboxes. A Boolean is just a 1 or 0 or a true or false. We're going to set the default value to checked. Then the next one I want to add is the seed, and the seed value is also going to be an integer. And well, what integers are, they are numbers without decimals. So they are full numbers, and I'm going to set the default value. Maybe let me add something to the max value. I'm going to set the default to 123. So that's our seed default. And then last but not least, I want to add some more data, and this is going to be the level. And I'm going to set this, well, the data type float is okay. Float does mean that it's a number, but it can have decimals. And the interface is going to be a float slider. We want to adjust the unit to be a length unit. And I'm going to set the maximum to 10 centimeters. So that's okay. I think, yeah, that's cool. I'm going to hit OK. And this is going to give me the interface here. All right. If I don't want this tab to be called user data, I can go to manage user data and add a new group, but make it root level. And now I'm going to rename it to train track controls. And instead of having all of these parameters as a child of the user data thing, we're gonna move them here to train track controls. Let's make sure that the T here is also uppercase. Hit OK, and now you can see that our tab is called train track controls. All right. Now let's drag and drop the spline in here and the rail spline in here. And now is the right time to set everything up in Xpresso, because we now just have an interface. But for example, if we switch here between the fastening type, nothing is happening. We can also replace the spline here with something else. We can disable the stones, but nothing will happen because we need to tell Cinema 4D what to do with this. All right. And now I'm going to create an Xpresso tag from the programming tags. Here we go. And as many of you might already know, Xpresso is a node-based programming language. That's the easiest way to explain it. Okay, let's rename this Xpresso tag to controls, because we're going to create another one later. And I'm going to drag and drop our user data tag in here. And the first thing I want to do is I want to set up the splines, or the spline link fields here. So let me just drag and drop the spline parameters here into Xpresso. And here we go. Now we need to define what we want to do with that, and also what we need here. First of all, well, let me unfold the rails here, and let me just drag and drop the spline and the rail spline instance here, because here we can define what we want to control with our user data here. So first thing is we want to replace the spline. So we want to go to object properties and choose reference object. We're going to do the same here, reference object. And now the thing is that by just using this, we can replace or swap the spline shape. But we also need to tell Cinema 4D that the position and rotation of the splines, which are linked here in our user data, should be inherited to these objects, because otherwise we will get rail spline problems or main spline problems. So they need to be aligned, and therefore we cannot just link these up. What we also need is a node which is called object. So we go to new node, Xpresso general object, and in here I'm gonna link this main spline into object. So now we can read different things here from this object. First of all, I just want to create another object output, because this is where we output the spline. And then I'm also going to add an output for the global matrix, because the global matrix holds everything regarding position, scale, and rotation. That's in here in the global matrix. So what we need here is an input for the global matrix, and also an input here for the global matrix. And by the way, by command double-clicking or control double-clicking on a PC, on the header of a node, you can make it that big here. Okay, what I want to do is I want to link up object into reference object and global matrix into global matrix. So that's already fine. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to create a copy of this object node here, and I'm gonna set this up for the rail spline as well. So now here we are going to get the splines from the user data, read out the spline data and the global matrix, which means position, scale, and rotation, and then feed it into our instance objects. Okay, that's cool, but we need to do this a little bit more often, because that's not the only place where we use that. Let's make a little bit more space here. And what I want to do is I want to have a look at the next one here. So in the cloner, we also linked the splines. Here in the object tab, you can see here we have the main spline and here we have the rail spline. So let's just add the cloner here as well. And I'm going to drag and drop the object parameter in here and the rail parameter. I'm gonna command double click. And now I'm going to link these together. Now we can just use the object output here and pipe it into the object input. And we need the object output here from the rail spline and pipe it into rail. Okay, now let's create a copy of this guy. And let's go down the hierarchy to our cloner stones mask. And we're gonna use that in this node here. We have to wire it up. Here we go. And now this one should be working as well. The last thing we need to adjust here is the rail bed thing, because here we again have these two splines, and let's just call this one instance 2 and this one also instance 2, because now we can just create copies of these two. Let's replace the reference object here with instance 2 and the reference object here with rail spline instance 2. And now we need to wire them up again, like so, and here as well. And now you can see that this is working. Let's move them like so, so we can have a better overview. Let's move this away. And now let's just do something to these splines here. For example, we can now replace the spline simply by creating a circle spline. Let's set this to XZ and the radius to, let's say, 1000 centimeters. And we're gonna set the number of immediate points to 32. And now if we link that into the main spline, you can see that this is already working. It's pointing to the inside because we didn't replace the rail spline, but that's okay for now because we already know that this is going to work. Cool. Good. Now the next thing we want to set up is the fastening type, and this is something that is really cool. So let me create another node here for the train track controls, and I'm going to train track controls type. This is the fastening type, and we want to link this into our fastening instance objects reference input. So here we have an input called reference object. So how can we create the connection between the number which is coming from here. And maybe let me show that to you. Let's create a new node, Xpresso general result, and let's wire this up. You can see that the result is 1 for now. If I go to concrete 2, you can see that the result is 2. And if I go to wood, the result is 3. And on the other side, we have this fastening types group, and we have concrete 1, concrete 2, and wood as separate objects. So if we were able to iterate through the hierarchy here, that should do it. And this is absolutely possible. All we need to do is we right click, go to new node, Xpresso, iterator, hierarchy. This is what we need. And well, let me first explain what this one does. First of all, you need a reference object, and we want the fastening types group null as the reference object. It's an absolute reference. And now there is a start path, which means that it's always going to do this first, and D stands for down. So what it's going to do is from this object, it's going down the hierarchy. So it's going to this hierarchical level here. And then, let me select the hierarchy node again. The iteration path is next. So it's going to the next object. So it's going down and next, and it's going to do that as often as it can. This is happening because the parameter maximum iterations is set to 0. If I set it to another number, we might have a change in the fastening type. So let's wire these up. We're going to set the object output here to the reference object input on the fastening instance object. And now you can see that our fastenings are our wood material or our wood fastenings. And this is because the whole thing is set to 0. It's going down and then next until it's at the end. If I set this to 1, you can see that we are now using concrete 1. If we set this to 2, this is concrete 2. And if we set it to 3, this is wood again. And then if we go up, it will just stay at wood. Okay, so let's just wire this up. We're going to release the wire here on the blue area and gonna set it to maximum iterations. And now it is wired up. So let me delete the result node and let's double check this. It's set to wood, that's correct. Let's set it to concrete 1, that's working. Concrete 2, also working. Wood, perfect. Okay, so that was a little bit more tricky, but we have more to do here because we want to add another instance, so to speak, of this train track controls user data tag. And let me have a look at the user data here. We are going to drag and drop these parameters here onto the output side to create the outputs. All right, now we have enable, seed, and level. This is pretty straightforward because everything that we need is in the Redshift matrix scatter object or in the matrix object. So let's bring this here. And the first thing we need is enable, and we find this under basic, enabled. So that's enabled or disabled. And let me just drag and drop that in here and make it a little bit bigger. Then the next thing is in the object tab, we need the seed, and we're just going to drag and drop it over here. So seed would go into seed. And then in the transform tab, we need the position Z as well. And we're going to use that as an input as well. So let's wire all of these up. This is pretty straightforward, like so. And now everything should work. So let's close this and let's have a look if it does. So enable, disable is working. Seed is working, and level is also working. Perfect. So now all of these controls are working. Right. Now what can we do next? Let me disable the stones here, because what I want to do now is I want to remap this whole checkerboard in a way that it is square, so that we have square checkerboards in here. This is one thing. And the other thing is that if the stones are enabled and we adjust the length of the whole spline, like so, you can see that the density is decreasing. And also the mapping here of the texture, it's also stretchy. Okay, so how can we do that? Let me bring this spline here, or the last point. Is it still in there? Yeah, let's set this to 500, or a little bit more, to something like this. Okay, so what we have here, we want to take care of the stretching first. What we have here is, if we go to the rail bed, we have a texture tag. And in here, there is a parameter called tiles v. And if we set this to 2, you can see that they are now almost square. So that's a good thing. We need to control this parameter here automatically by using what? Well, actually, what we need to use is the ratio between the lengths of these splines here. So we need to compare this railbed profile spline with the spline which is giving us the shape, and if we compare those, we can create the ratio value and pipe that into the tiles V here. Okay, let's do that. I'm going to create a new Xpresso tag here, and this is going to be called mapping. And we need 2 splines. First of all, we need from the user data, the main spline. It's important that we choose this one because it can always be replaced. So we need to use this one here because then this is a dynamic thing. And then next we need the rockbed spline and its object output. Now, how can we read out the length of these splines? We can right click, new node, Xpresso, general, and then down here we see that there is a spline node. So let's create one of these, and we're going to pipe the train track controls main spline here into the object input, and we don't need the position output, so we delete the port, and instead we're going to use the length output. And now let's also create another result node to check the result. So the length of the main spline is around 1400. Okay, now let's create a copy of these simply by command or control dragging and dropping. And we're going to do the same with the rockbed spline. And here we have 700, around 700. So if we divide the length of the main spline here by the length of the rockbed spline, we should get a value close to 2. And this is what we need in here. So this is going to be our right result. So how can we divide one value by another? We simply right click, go to new node, Xpresso, and this time we go to calculate and math. And in here, we can set the math function from add to divide. So now if we divide this spline length by this spline length and just copy the result node and have a look at it, we get a result which is, let's say, close to 2. That is good because now we can also just drag and drop this material tag in here, and we're going to drag and drop the tiles V parameter here onto the input side of the material node, and then we link them up. And now we have perfect squares. As long as the main spline is straight, we have perfect squares. So let me double check. We can now add or subtract length here simply by moving this point around. You can see that it squares all of the time. If we create a bending, you can see that it's stretching here, but that's okay. All right, now let's do the same with the matrices here. Oh, we need to activate them here with the stones, I mean. And basically what we need to do here is, if we go to the matrix object, we know that we typed in 20,000. So if we multiply the value which is coming out here, which is around 2, then we should get the right number. So let's create a copy of the divide node and set it to multiply. And now we're feeding in the output of the divide math node. And for the second input, I'm just going to type in 10,000. And now we can link this into the Redshift matrix scatter objects count. So let's create this as an input and we'll wire these up. Here we go. So that's looking quite good. We can get rid of the result nodes now, close the Xpresso editor, and for now it's working. Now let's make the spline here a little bit longer, like so. That's looking good. And let's also replace the spline by the circle spline. That's also perfect. Maybe let's also increase the radius, let's say to 2000. And you can see that the density is still the same no matter what we do. And that's perfect. That's exactly what we want. So the setup is pretty much complete. I'm going to replace this spline with our initial main spline, and maybe let's create a bending like so. And right now I just noticed that snapping is enabled, so let's deactivate this, and let's also use this point here and move it to this side here. So that's looking pretty good. Okay, so the next thing would be to set this up to be used in Redshift. All right, so let's do this. First of all, I want to replace some materials, but let me disable the stones first. And let me also have a look at our Redshift render view, because here I'm going to see what's going on. Okay, we need to assign a few materials. The first one is going to be our rock bed material, and I just want to replace our checkerboard here. So this is okay. I don't want this to be displaced. This is something we could add, but I don't want to do this now. The second thing I want to do is I want to add the rails material here to the rails. And as you can see, one thing that is quite cool about this material is that there is a lot of rust here on the sides, but on top you can see that we have iron here. Maybe let me go to the Redshift dome light and let's replace the HDR here. So let's search for another HDR and let's use the nice sunset that I used in the other scene as well. Where is it? Here we go. Let's drag and drop this in to general. Here we go. And let's also make this visible by enabling the background. And I want to rotate it. So let me go to the rotate tool. And in here, I want to rotate it until we have the sunset right in the frame. Okay, so this is pretty nice. And what I want to show you is how I created that mask here. So let me open up this Rails material. Here we go. It's not as complicated as it's looking. It's just a few basic noises layered and then color remapped. And there are two materials basically. One is the rust material, one is the iron material. And down here, this is where I'm creating the mask. Let me make this a little bit smaller, like so. And let's solo this one, because here we can see what the mask is looking like. Okay, so what I did here is I used a ramp. This is the ramp that is giving me like the iron here on top. And then I'm using a curvature node. And the cool thing, what I did here is if I mute this this noise which is coming into the radius here, you can see that the curvature is pretty linear, but as soon as I reactivate it, you can see that we get some noise here, and this makes the whole setup look more natural. And in the end, if I bring everything together, it's looking like this. Give it a second, here we go. And yeah, now let's deactivate the solo here. By the way, this is a question I get quite often. What I'm using here are the Cinema 4D nodes. And people were asking me how they can use the Cinema 4D nodes instead of the Redshift nodes. And it's pretty easy. All you need to do is you need to make sure that the renderer is set to Redshift, because this will make sure that the node space is also set to Redshift. And now if I create a node node material, this material will automatically be a Redshift material. And this way you can use the Cinema 4D node system with all of its advantages. For example, grouping of nodes or creating assets, stuff like that. Okay, one thing we didn't do yet is, we didn't create the stones here. So let me go back to the object manager, and here in the matrix scatter, let me enable the stones again, because we already set this up here in the user data tag. You can see that we're getting pink spheres. Why is that? Pink spheres instead of stones. Let me go and have a look into the Redshift object tag here. And in the Redshift object tag, you can define particles in here, and that's what we want to do. By default, this is set to optimize spheres. That's the default for the matrix scatter object. But we can set this to custom objects. Now the spheres are gone, and what we can do instead is we can select all of these stones here and then go back in the attributes manager history and just drag and drop them in here. And yeah, what we need to do here is this stones group needs to be visible. So here we go. Now we have our stones here, and you can see that we can navigate really fast. And the reason for that is that matrices are quite light. So we are just moving the matrices onto the GPU, and the GPU is doing all of that instantiation stuff. So that's why it's so fast. Okay, so there is a last thing that I want to show you here in this setup, and this is how to add some variation to the textures here of the fastenings. All right, let me go to the wood material, and in here, if we solo the texture, you can see that there is not much variation going on. So let me also deactivate the stones, then we can see it even better. So let's have a look at, for example, this spot here. So it's here, it's there, here, here, here. So it's all repetitive. You can also see it at this dark spot, here it is, there, here, and so on. So what we actually need to do is to add some variation here in the UV mapping. And usually inside of Cinema 4D, I would use the variation shader, but we don't have a variation shader in Redshift. So how can we add variation here? It is not too difficult. What I want to do is I want to add a random effector here to the fastenings, to the cloner. So let me add a random effector. Here we go, and I'm gonna hold down Command or Control on the PC, and by default you can see, all right, that's randomizing all of the positions. I don't want that. What I want is color, and I want the effector color to be randomized. So we don't see it here yet, but we can already see it in here in the top view. What we also see is that many fastenings here are quite dark, and this is because by default the random effector is set to create a randomness into positive and negative directions. So for example, if I set the position variation or position randomization up to 50, here you can see that some of these fastenings are going down and some of them are going up. So it's plus and minus directions. What we can do is here in the effector tab, we can unfold the min-max, and you can see that the minimum is set to minus 100%. Let's bring it up to 0. And suddenly all of the fastenings are here and the randomization is just going into one direction. That's exactly what we need. And you can also see that here the fastenings got way more colorful. Okay, let's deactivate position again because we just need the color here. So how can we read this color in the Redshift materials? All right, what we need is a node called color user data. So I type in user, and here is the color user data node. And I just want to set it to solo. Here you can see that it's all black, and that's not a mistake. It's just because the default color is set to black and we didn't specify an attribute name. So what we need to do is we need to link that node to the MoGraph color. And we can do that by using one of the presets. We go to MoGraph, color, and here we go. Now we have colorful fastenings. Okay, how can we use this color in order to control the UV offset? Well, that's pretty easy. We can just link this one into remap offset. And this is a vector, which means that it's actually 2 values. Color is 3 values, red, green, and blue. And red and green are now mapped onto U and V. And this is why this is working. So let's solo this one, the texture node. And now we can see that there is some colorization going on. Let's redo this. And here we can see that we now have a lot of variation. Cool. We can also wire this color user data up to this ramp here, because in this ramp we are going to adjust the colorization a little bit. So let's unmute the wire, and this means that we're going to create some color variation in the end. If I solo this one, you can see that some of them are a little bit brighter than others. It's very subtle, but that's what it is. Okay. So here we go. Now we also created some randomness, and this is actually what I wanted to show here. So maybe one last thing to tidy things up is we can clean this up a lot. If we create a layer, just double click here in the layer and we say lock and hide, then we can just middle click the train track generator here, and by using command or control, I'm going to subtract the parent here from the rest of the selection, and I'm going to just drag and drop everything onto this layer here. So everything, all of these objects here are now belonging to this layer. And I'm going to do the same with the Xpresso tags. Now they all belong to this layer, and what I can do now is I can lock all of these, and I can also hide them away here in the hierarchy. And now all that's left is the train track generator object here and its user data tag. And if I also want to adjust the icon, I can, for example, go to the basic tab, and in here there are some icon settings. So I could use another icon. So let me go to Window, Customization, Customize Commands. And what I want to use is the icon of Matrix Extrude here. And what I need to do in order to use its icon is I go down to the ID, right click, copy the text, and then I paste it here. And now you can already see that we're using this icon here as the icon for the train track generator. Now, usually when it comes to color coding, we're using like this greenish color for generators. This is also something we can do. We can set the icon color to custom and then just set it to green. All right, that's pretty much the whole setup. We now are left with just one object here. We have an interface and we can adjust the spline here. So maybe let me adjust the spline a little bit to something like this. And let's also activate the stones again. And then in the end, let's also render this. By the way, if you want to create plants in here, like a little bit of grass or flowers, just a little bit, it's the same technique as with the stones. All right, now let's render this. And I think I'm pretty happy with that. All right, I hope you enjoyed it and also learned something new. And as a member of the Maxon training team, I want to encourage you to visit the Maxon website and go to the events section, because here you can find out everything about our upcoming webinars. If you didn't know, we are running a demystifying webinar each Monday covering the whole Maxon product palette. We are also doing Ask the Trainer sessions twice a month on Thursdays, where you can ask your question live and we try to answer these questions as good as we can. And all of these sessions will be recorded or have been recorded already, and we're hosting them on the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel, so also definitely check this one out. Another thing I want to encourage you to do is to go to our certification pages and find out more about our new certification program. And there's also a free Cinema 4D knowledge test that you can take in order to check out where you're strong and where there might be room for improvement. Cool. I hope to see you in one of our upcoming webinars, and until then, stay safe and goodbye.